He was never the same after that one night in 1831 on a South Carolina plantation, when a woman crossed a line that would transform a man forever, and she had no idea what she was about to unleash. This is the story of how a single act of transgression shattered the carefully constructed world of Thornfield Plantation, and how one enslaved man discovered something so powerful that no system of oppression could ever take it from him. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about power, humanity, and the price of recognition. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Thornfield Manor, casting delicate shadows across Margaret Ashford's pale face. She sat at her vanity, watching her lady's maid arrange her hair with practiced precision, and felt absolutely nothing. 28 years old, wife of one of South Carolina's most powerful plantation owners, mistress of a house that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. This was the gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, suffocating on the inside. Her husband, Thomas Ashford, had given her everything a woman of her station could want. Everything except freedom. Everything except choice. Everything except the right to think her own thoughts without fear of correction. The plantation was a kingdom, and Thomas was its absolute ruler. And Margaret was his most prized possession, displayed at dinner parties, paraded at social events, kept pristine and silent and obedient. The silence was the worst part. She moved through the days like an automaton. Breakfast at 7, needlework in the morning room, lunch with the other plantation wives where they discussed nothing of substance, the weather, the latest fashions from Charleston, the tiresome business of managing servants, afternoon tea, dinner at 8 where she sat across from Thomas and listened to him discuss politics, cotton prices, and the management of his human property with the same casual tone he might use to discuss his horses. But what he didn't know was that Margaret had begun to read. Secretly, carefully. In the library after midnight by candlelight, she had discovered a world that existed beyond the narrow confines of her life. Philosophy, poetry, essays on human rights and moral philosophy, books that Thomas would have burned if he'd known she possessed them, books that had begun to crack the walls of her carefully constructed ignorance. And with that knowledge came something far more dangerous: conscience. She began to notice things she had trained herself not to see: the screams from the slave quarters at night, the way the enslaved people moved through the plantation with their eyes cast down, their spirits broken, the casual brutality that no one else seemed to acknowledge, the way her own comfort, her silk dresses, her jewelry, her leisurely afternoons, was built on a foundation of human suffering so vast she could barely comprehend it. Thomas noticed her distraction. "You're quiet these days, Margaret," he said one evening, his tone carrying a warning beneath the words. They were in his study, and he was pouring himself bourbon. "Is something troubling you?" "No," she lied, the word automatic. "I'm simply tired." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt the familiar chill of his scrutiny. Thomas Ashford was a handsome man in the way that powerful men often are, commanding, confident, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. But there was something in his eyes that had always frightened her, a coldness, an absolute certainty that the world existed for his benefit, and that anyone who questioned that was either naive or dangerous. "See that you remain so," he said finally. "I don't appreciate wives who think too much. It makes them difficult." That night Margaret lay in her bed, separate from Thomas's, as was proper, and listened to the sounds of the plantation, the crickets, the distant barking of dogs, and something else, something that made her heart clench: screams, muffled, desperate screams coming from the direction of the slave quarters. She got out of bed and went to the window. In the moonlight she could see torches moving near the quarters, could see figures, could hear the crack of a whip, could hear a man's voice, the overseer's, shouting commands. She pressed her hand against the glass and felt tears begin to slide down her face. This was the world she inhabited. This was the price of her comfort. And she could no longer pretend she didn't know it. The next morning, she learned what had happened. One of the enslaved men, Samuel, she later learned his name was, had been caught attempting to reading. The crime was that he had been found with a book in his possession, attempting to teach himself letters. Thomas spoke about it at breakfast with the same casual tone he might use to discuss a broken fence post. "The man was punished accordingly," he said, spreading jam on his toast. 20 lashes, he won't make that mistake again." Margaret felt the room tilt. 20 lashes? For wanting to read, for wanting to know something beyond the narrow prison of his own ignorance. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. Why would you punish him for that? Thomas set down his toast and looked at her with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was pity. Because an educated slave is a dangerous slave, Margaret. It plants ideas. Ideas of freedom. Ideas of equality. Ideas that make them forget their place. This is mercy, actually. Better a few lashes now than a rebellion later. But what Thomas didn't understand was that Margaret had already seen Samuel. Not just seen him, recognized him. He worked in the gardens and she had noticed him weeks ago. Not because he was handsome, though he was, but because of the way he moved, with a kind of contained grace, with intelligence visible in every gesture. And she had wondered, as she watched him work, what thoughts occupied his mind, what dreams he harbored in the privacy of his own consciousness. And now she knew he dreamed of reading, of learning, of knowing more than the world had allowed him to know. That afternoon, she found an excuse to walk through the gardens. She told her lady's maid she needed air, needed to gather flowers for the house. The maid followed at a discreet distance, as was proper, but Margaret managed to position herself near the work area where Samuel was tending the roses. She saw him from a distance first. Saw the way he moved carefully, deliberately, as if each gesture required thought. Saw the bandages visible beneath his torn shirt. The wounds from the lashes, still fresh. He was on his knees in the dirt, pruning roses with meticulous care when she approached. He didn't look up immediately. He had been trained not to. But she saw his body stiffen, saw his hands still. "The roses are beautiful this year," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. He looked up then, and she saw the shock in his eyes, the confusion. Plantation mistresses did not speak to enslaved men. It was not done. It was improper. It was dangerous. "Yes, ma'am," he said carefully, his eyes returning to the ground. But in that brief moment when he had looked at her, she had seen something in his face. Intelligence. Awareness. A mind that was fully, completely present in the world. A man, not a thing. And something inside her shifted irrevocably. That night, she lay in bed and thought about the books in the library. Thought about the words she had read about human dignity and moral philosophy. Thought about the contradiction between those words and the world she inhabited. Thought about a man on his knees in the dirt, his back striped with welts, his mind hungry for knowledge. And she made a decision. It was a decision that would shatter everything. A decision that would cross lines that were not meant to be crossed. A decision that would transform not just her life, but his. A decision that would set in motion events that no one could stop or control. That night, Margaret made a choice that would change everything, and she had no idea what she was about to unleash. 3 nights later, Margaret stood at her bedroom window and waited for the house to fall silent. This was the hardest part, the waiting. The terrible, stretching silence that seemed to go on forever. She had changed into a dark dress, something that would not show dirt or blood if she stumbled in the darkness. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought surely someone would hear it, would come to investigate, would discover her before she even left the house. At midnight, the plantation finally settled into sleep. She could hear Thomas snoring from his room down the hall. The servants had retired to their quarters. The house was hers alone. She moved through the darkness like a phantom, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors, down the main staircase, through the parlor, out through the side door that led to the gardens. The night air was cool against her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. The slave quarters were a quarter-mile from the house, down a path that Margaret had never walked before. She had seen them from a distance, of course, had been aware of their existence in the abstract way that one is aware of things one chooses not to examine too closely. But walking toward them now, in the darkness, with the full knowledge of what she was doing, it felt like crossing into another world entirely. Every step was a transgression. She was violating the most fundamental law of the plantation. A white woman, alone, walking toward the slave quarters in the middle of the night. If anyone saw her, if anyone reported her, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just for her, though her life as she knew it would be over, but for Samuel. The consequences for him would be far, far worse. She thought about turning back. She thought about how easy it would be to simply return to the house, to her bed, to her gilded cage, to pretend this impulse had never seized her, to go back to being the woman who saw nothing, knew nothing, was responsible for nothing. But she couldn't, because she had seen Samuel's face, had recognized the man behind the enslaved body, and that recognition was a burden she could no longer carry alone. The quarters loomed ahead of her, small wooden structures barely more than shacks arranged in neat rows. Most were dark, most were silent. But she could feel the presence of people behind those walls. Families, children, men and women whose entire lives were contained within these structures that barely seemed sturdy enough to withstand a strong wind. She had to find Samuel's cabin. She had watched him carefully over the past 3 days, noting which structure he entered at the end of the day. The third one from the end, on the left. She moved toward it, her hands trembling now, her breath coming in short gasps. What was she doing? What madness had seized her? She reached the door, stood before it, raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. If she knocked, if she committed to this action, there would be no going back. Everything would change. Everything would be at risk. She knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. She thought perhaps he was asleep, thought perhaps she had the wrong cabin, thought perhaps this entire night was a terrible mistake and she should run back to the house and pretend none of this had happened. Then she heard movement inside, heard footsteps, heard the sound of someone waking, confused. The door opened slowly, cautiously, and Samuel stood before her in the darkness, shirtless, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The shock on his face was absolute. He stared at her for a long moment, as if she might be a hallucination, as if his mind could not quite process what his eyes were seeing. A white woman, standing at his door, in the middle of the night. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. There was fear in it, confusion, suspicion. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Margaret said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin, frightened, determined. "But I needed to see you. I needed to—" She stopped. How could she explain this? How could she articulate what had driven her into the night? "May I come inside?" He hesitated. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the danger assessment, the understanding that her presence in his cabin, if discovered, would be catastrophic for him, that she was asking him to risk everything. But he stepped aside and let her in. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room, a narrow bed, a small table, a chair, a fireplace with no fire. It was cold and sparse and utterly devoid of comfort, and yet it was his, the only space in the world that was entirely his own. She stood in the center of the room, suddenly aware of how improper this was, how utterly transgressive. A white woman, alone, in an enslaved man's cabin, in the middle of the night. If anyone discovered this, the scandal would be absolute, the consequences unthinkable. "Why are you here?" Samuel asked. His voice was steady now, but she could see the tension in his body. The way he stood, ready to move, ready to protect himself or her or both of them from whatever was about to happen. "Because I needed to tell you something," Margaret said. "Because I saw you. In the garden. I saw you, and I recognized you, and I couldn't stop thinking about it." "Recognized me?" He looked confused. "Ma'am, You're not just anything," she interrupted. "You're a man. You're a thinking man. You're a man who wanted to read, who wanted to know things, who wanted to be more than what this world has decided you should be." She saw something shift in his face, saw the careful mask slip for just a moment, revealing the raw nerve beneath. "That was foolish," he said quietly. "That reading, that was foolish, and it cost me." "I know," Margaret said. "I know what they did to you. I heard about it, and I wanted you to know that I know, that I see you, that you're not—" She struggled for the words. "You're not invisible to me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to the small table and gestured for her to sit. She did, and he sat across from her, and in the moonlight coming through the small window, she could see his face clearly, saw the intelligence there, saw the pain, saw the terrible, careful control he maintained over every expression, every gesture. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you risk this? Why would you come here?" Margaret thought about the books in the library, thought about the words she had read about human dignity and moral philosophy, thought about the contradiction between those words and the world she inhabited. "Because I'm complicit," she said. "Because I live in comfort built on your suffering, and I pretended not to see it, and I can't pretend any more. I can't unsee you." He looked at her for a long time, and then, very carefully, he asked, "What do you want from me?" It was a fair question, a dangerous question, because the truth was, Margaret didn't entirely know. She had come to his cabin driven by something she couldn't name, a need to acknowledge his humanity, a need to cross the lines that had been drawn so carefully around her life, a need to do something that mattered, that was real, that was true. "I want to talk to you," she said finally. "I want to know you. I want to understand what you think about, what you dream about. I want to know the man beneath what they've tried to make you into." And in the darkness of that small cabin, on that night in 1831, they began to talk. But neither of them understood that this conversation, this transgression, had already set something in motion that could not be stopped, that by the end of the night everything would be different, that he would never be the same after this. They talked until the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, and in those hours Samuel's entire understanding of the world shifted beneath his feet like tectonic plates realigning, creating new landscapes of possibility where before there had been only the flat, unchanging terrain of acceptance. Margaret asked him questions. Simple questions at first, the kind that seemed innocent enough on the surface but carried profound implications beneath. What was his name? Where was he from? How long had he been at Thornfield? But as the night deepened and the walls between them began to crumble like ancient fortifications under siege, the questions became more profound, more searching, more dangerous. What did he think about when he was alone? What did he dream of in those private moments when no one was watching? What did he want his life to become? Who did he imagine he might be if the world had not decided for him? No one had ever asked him these things. No one had ever seemed to care what existed inside his mind, behind his eyes, in the private chambers of his consciousness where he kept the truest parts of himself locked away like treasures in a vault. He had learned early, learned it through observation and through pain, to hide those things. To present a blank, obedient exterior while keeping his true self sealed away where no one could touch it, control it, diminish it, or destroy it. It was a survival mechanism, as essential to his continued existence as breathing. But Margaret's questions were different. They weren't interrogations designed to catch him in some transgression, weren't tools of power wielded to extract confession or compliance. They were genuine inquiries. They came from a place of real curiosity, real hunger to understand him not as a slave, not as a piece of property, not as a body to be worked and controlled, but as a person, as a human being with an inner life as complex and valuable as her own. "I was born in Virginia," he told her, his voice low in the darkness, barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile bubble of safety they had created in this small room. "My mother was enslaved on a tobacco plantation near Petersburg. My father was—" He paused, and she saw something flicker across his face like lightning illuminating a storm-darkened landscape. Pain, shame, anger, a complicated tangle of emotions that had no simple name. "My father was the overseer." Margaret felt her breath catch. She understood immediately what this meant, understood the implications, understood the violation embedded in that simple statement. "I never knew him," Samuel continued, his voice steady now, as if he had rehearsed this story many times in his own mind, had examined it from every angle until it had become almost bearable. "Not really. He acknowledged me once, when I was very small. I remember it clearly, remember every detail of that moment with a clarity that seems impossible for something that happened so long ago. He came to the cabin where my mother and I lived. He was drunk. He told my mother that I was a lucky boy because I had his features, that I might be worth something because of that, that I had better develop a useful skill because my looks wouldn't protect me forever. That was the only thing he ever gave me. Not affection, not protection, not even acknowledgement beyond that single, drunken moment. Just the burden of his blood and the knowledge that I was the product of a violation." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She didn't speak. There were no words adequate to the weight of what he had just shared. "When I was 12 years old," Samuel continued, "my mother was sold. Sold away from me as if we had no connection, as if the bond between a mother and son was worth nothing in the ledgers of commerce. I remember the day. I remember watching from the fields as the slave trader's wagon came to collect her. I remember her looking back at me, and I remember the expression on her face. It was the expression of someone who understood that she was losing everything, that she would never see her child again, that the world had decided that our connection was less important than the price she would bring at market." He stopped speaking for a moment, and Margaret could see him struggling with the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. She waited. She had learned in these hours with him that sometimes the most important thing one person could do for another was simply to wait, to bear witness, to not look away. "I never saw her again," he said finally. "Not in all the years that have passed since that day. I was kept at the plantation, trained as a field hand, taught the skills that would make me valuable as a worker, taught to obey without question, taught to suppress any thought or feeling that might interfere with my usefulness. And then, 5 years ago, I was sold to your husband, to Thornfield. I was put on a wagon and brought here, and I have been here ever since, working in the fields and the gardens, trying to survive in a world that has decided that my life belongs to someone else." Margaret felt something twist inside her chest. The casual way he said it, the way he had simply accepted this as the natural order of things, as if human beings were commodities to be bought and sold like cattle or bolts of cloth. As if the dissolution of family bonds, the separation of mothers from children, was simply the cost of doing business in a civilized society. "How did you learn to read?" she asked, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "After everything, after all of that, how did you find the will to learn? How did you find the courage?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He seemed to be looking back through time, examining memories that were clearly painful but also precious, like examining a jewel that had been purchased at great cost. "There was a woman," he said finally, "a poor, white woman who lived on the edge of the plantation. Her name was Rebecca. She was kind in a way that was rare. She saw me once, saw me watching her from a distance, and instead of looking away or calling for help, she smiled at me. just smiled. That simple gesture was revolutionary. It suggested that I was a person worthy of recognition, worthy of kindness, worthy of seeing. He paused, and Margaret could see the memory playing across his face like shadows on a wall. She began to leave books in the woods, he continued. Books that she had somehow acquired. I would find them hidden beneath stones or in the hollows of trees. She taught me letters. She would write them in the dirt, and I would trace them with a stick. She taught me how to sound out words, how to understand that the marks on a page were a kind of language, a way of capturing human thought and preserving it so that it could be shared across time and distance. She risked so much for that. If anyone had discovered that she was teaching an enslaved man to read, she would have been ostracized by her own community. She would have been seen as a traitor to her race, her class, her entire social position. "What happened to her?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "She disappeared," Samuel said quietly. "One day she was there, and the next day she was gone. I never saw her again. I don't know if she was forced to leave the area, or if something worse happened to her. But I never forgot what she taught me, and I never stopped reading. I found other books. I hid them. I read by candlelight in the darkness of my cabin, knowing that if I was discovered, the consequences would be severe." "It's not foolish to want to know things," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's not a crime to want to educate yourself. It's human. It's the most human thing there is." "Human," Samuel repeated, as if tasting the word, examining it from all sides. "That's what they're afraid of, isn't it? That we'll realize we're human, that we'll understand that we have minds and thoughts and dreams just like they do, that we're not less than, that we're not meant to be owned, that we have the same capacity for love and pain and joy and sorrow as anyone else. Once you see that, once you truly understand it, you can never go back to accepting the world as it is presented to you." Margaret felt tears beginning to slide down her face. She had spent so many years trying not to see, trying to maintain the comfortable fiction that the world operated according to some natural law, that some people were simply meant to be enslaved, that this was simply the way things were and had always been. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, that's exactly what they're afraid of. That's exactly what I've been afraid of. Because if I admit that you're human, if I truly see your humanity, then I have to confront my own complicity. I have to admit that I have benefited from your suffering, that I have lived in comfort built on your pain." They talked about books. Margaret described the volumes she had read in secret, hidden away in the library where Thomas rarely ventured. She told him about the philosophers and poets and essayists whose words had begun to crack open her understanding of the world. Philosophy, poetry, essays on human rights and dignity, treatises on the nature of freedom and the social contract, works that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which her entire world was built. Samuel listened with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. It was as if she was feeding a part of him that had been starving, a part of him that had been denied nourishment for so long that it had almost forgotten how to hunger. His eyes grew bright with each new idea she introduced. His questions became more sophisticated, more probing, more searching. "There's a book," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "by a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's a French philosopher. He writes about the social contract, about how no man has the natural authority to rule another, about how all men are born free and equal. He writes that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, that the social order is not a natural order, but a constructed one, maintained through force and the manipulation of consciousness. It's revolutionary. It's dangerous. The kind of book that could get a person killed if the wrong people discovered they were reading it." "Dangerous?" Samuel repeated, and she could hear the hunger in his voice. "Because it's true." "Yes," Margaret said, "because it's true. Because it articulates something that people have always known in their bones but have been taught to suppress. That this system of slavery, this hierarchy of power, it's not natural. It's not ordained by God or by nature. It's a construction, a fiction that we have all agreed to believe because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. They talked deep into the night. Samuel asked her to describe the books she had read. He wanted to know everything: the names of the authors, the central arguments, the passages that had moved her most profoundly, and Margaret found herself becoming a kind of bridge between the world of written knowledge and the man before her who had been denied access to that world. She was translating. She was sharing. She was committing an act of intellectual rebellion that was as transgressive as anything physical could be. As the night deepened, she told him about her own life, about the gilded cage that had been built around her from birth, about the slow suffocation of being a woman in a world that had decided what she should be and would not tolerate even the smallest deviation from that predetermined path, about the way Thomas controlled her, shaped her, demanded her obedience in all things, about the way her thoughts were monitored, her movements restricted, her very consciousness colonized by the men who claimed to own her. "But you have freedom," Samuel said gently, and she could hear the careful way he was choosing his words, the way he was trying not to minimize her experience while also being honest about the differences in their situations. "You can walk outside without permission. You can speak to people. You can own things. You can read books, even if you have to hide them." "I have the appearance of freedom," Margaret corrected, and there was bitterness in her voice now. "But it's an illusion. I am owned just as surely as you are owned. The chains are just prettier. They're made of silk and diamonds instead of iron. They're invisible instead of visible. But they're chains nonetheless. And sometimes I think that the invisible chains are worse because you can almost convince yourself that they don't exist. You can almost convince yourself that you're free, when in fact you're imprisoned." Samuel considered this carefully. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "But your chains have some give in them. Mine do not. You can imagine escape. You can imagine a different life. You can read books and dream of different worlds. I cannot even imagine that much. The constraints on my life are so complete, so total, that I have had to teach myself not to imagine at all. Because imagination is a kind of torture when you know that the things you imagine are impossible." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a statement of fact, a clear-eyed assessment of his situation, and it was that acceptance, that terrible, heartbreaking clarity that broke something open inside Margaret. She felt something shift in her chest. Some barrier that she had constructed to protect herself from the full weight of what was happening in the world around her simply gave way. She reached across the small table and took his hand. It was a transgression, a violation of every law, written and unwritten, that governed their world. A white woman touching an enslaved man, touching him not as a master touches a servant, not as an owner touches property, but as one person touches another, with tenderness, with recognition, with the simple acknowledgement that they were both human beings deserving of connection and dignity. It was forbidden. It was dangerous. It was unthinkable. His hand was calloused, scarred from years of labor, warm, real, alive in a way that made her acutely aware of her own aliveness, her own physical presence in the world. "I don't know what I'm doing," Margaret said, and her voice was shaking now. "I don't know what I'm asking for or what I can offer you. I don't know if this is madness or if it's the only sane thing I've ever done. I don't know if this is enough or if it's just another form of cruelty, offering you a glimpse of connection and recognition that I can never truly provide. But I know that I can't go back to pretending I don't see you. I know that you matter, that your thoughts matter, that your life matters, that your humanity matters. And I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that at least one person in this world sees you and recognizes your humanity, that at least one person understands that you are not a thing to be owned, but a person to be known." Samuel looked at their joined hands for a long moment. The contrast was stark. Her hand was soft, uncalloused, pale. His was dark, scarred, hardened by years of labor. But together they looked like something whole, like a completion, like a bridge between two worlds that were not meant to touch but had found a way to do so anyway. Then he looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. It wasn't gratitude, though there was some of that. It wasn't even hope, though there was some of that, too. It was recognition. A mirror held up to her own yearning. An acknowledgement that he saw her too. That he recognized the woman trapped inside the role she had been forced to play. That he understood her imprisonment even if it was different from his own. That he saw her as a person, not just as a mistress, not just as a white woman, not just as an extension of the system that had enslaved him. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the words seemed to contain multitudes. "For seeing me, for coming here, for risking everything just to acknowledge that I exist, that I matter. Thank you." They sat like that as the darkness began to fade, as the night surrendered to dawn, as the world outside began to wake up, unaware of the revolution that had taken place in this small cabin, a revolution of consciousness, a crossing of lines that were not meant to be crossed, a moment of true connection between two people who had been taught by the world that such connection was impossible. They talked about what it meant to be human. They talked about freedom and slavery, not just as physical states but as states of consciousness. They talked about the power of knowledge and the danger of awareness. They talked about love, though neither of them used that word. They talked about the future, though both of them understood that they had no future together, that the world would never allow what was beginning between them to flourish. And yet they talked. And in talking, they created something. A space, a moment, a memory that would sustain them both in the terrible times that were to come. When the first light of true dawn began to break through the small window of the cabin, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, Margaret knew she had to leave. She had to return to the house before anyone noticed her absence. She had to resume her role as dutiful wife, as proper mistress, as the woman the world expected her to be. She had to go back into the cage. But something fundamental had changed inside her, something that could not be changed back. Some part of her that had been asleep had awakened. Some part of her that had been dead had come back to life. "Will you come again?" Samuel asked as she moved toward the door. His voice was tentative, hopeful, terrified. He was asking her to commit to something that could destroy them both. Margaret hesitated. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that she was risking everything, that she should walk away now, before this went any further, before the consequences became unbearable, that she should return to her comfortable ignorance, her willful blindness, her complicity. But she had already crossed the line. She had already transgressed. She had already seen him and been seen by him. And she found that she could not go back to the world of pretense and denial that she had inhabited before. That world no longer existed for her. It had been destroyed by a single act of recognition. "Yes," she said, "I will come again. I don't know how or when, but I will find a way. I promise you that." And as she walked back through the pre-dawn darkness toward the house, back toward her gilded cage, she understood that she had just made a choice that would define the rest of her life. A choice that would set in motion events that no one could control or stop. A choice that would transform not just her world, but his. A choice that would demand a price far greater than she could possibly imagine. She had seen him, and in seeing him, she had awakened something in herself that could never be put back to sleep. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had made a connection that could not be severed, no matter what the world did to try to tear them apart. She had become complicit in her own transgression, and she would never be the same. But what neither of them knew was that their transgression had already been witnessed, that someone had seen Margaret slip out of the house in the darkness, that someone had watched her return in the pre-dawn light, that the machinery of their world was already beginning to turn against them, that by the end of this story, everything would be destroyed, that he would never be the same after this night, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Margaret moved through the house like a woman in a dream. Every gesture felt carefully calculated. Every word felt like a performance. She sat at breakfast across from Thomas and tried to eat, though the food turned to ash in her mouth. She smiled when appropriate. She nodded at the right moments. She was a perfect automaton, executing the role she had been trained to play. But inside, everything was chaos. Her mind was still in that small cabin. Her hand still felt the warmth of Samuel's touch. Her ears still echoed with the sound of his voice, speaking truths that had shattered her carefully constructed worldview into fragments that could never be reassembled into their original shape. "You're distracted this morning," Thomas observed, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. There was a note of warning in his voice, the tone he used when he was beginning to suspect that something was not quite right, the tone that made her skin crawl with fear. "I slept poorly," Margaret said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. It was a dangerous game, this lying. Thomas could read deception like other men read newspapers. He had spent a lifetime studying the faces of enslaved people, learning to detect the slightest sign of rebellion or resistance in their expressions. He had honed his ability to see through lies and evasions until it had become almost supernatural in its accuracy. "Indeed," Thomas said, and she could see him studying her face, searching for the truth beneath her words. "You look flushed. Are you ill?" "No," Margaret said. "Simply tired. I had strange dreams." Thomas continued to study her for a moment longer, then seemed to accept her explanation. He returned his attention to his breakfast, but Margaret could feel the weight of his suspicion. It hung in the air between them like a threat. She excused herself as soon as she could, claiming a headache, retreating to her room where she could be alone with her thoughts. She sat at her window and looked out over the gardens, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She had been so careful. She'd left no evidence. No one could possibly know where she had been. And yet she felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her transgression was written across her face in letters large enough for the entire world to read. The day passed with agonizing slowness. She occupied herself with needlework, though her hands shook so badly that she could barely hold the needle. She tried to read, but the words seemed to swim before her eyes, refusing to cohere into meaning. She took a walk through the gardens in the afternoon, ostensibly to gather flowers, though in reality she was trying to catch a glimpse of Samuel, to confirm that he was real, that last night had actually happened and was not simply an elaborate dream conjured by her desperate, lonely mind. She saw him working near the roses, his movements careful and deliberate, his face a mask of perfect servitude. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge her in any way. And yet she could feel the awareness between them, a kind of electric current running beneath the surface of their careful performances. That night, she waited in her room until the house fell silent. She changed into her dark dress again. She moved through the darkness with the practiced stealth of a woman who had already committed one transgression and found that the second was somehow easier, though no less terrifying. The path to the slave quarters seemed shorter this time, or perhaps she was simply more accustomed to the fear. She reached Samuel's cabin and knocked, her heart thundering in her chest. He opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting for her, as if he had known she would come. Perhaps he had. Perhaps there was something between them now that transcended the normal boundaries of communication, a kind of knowledge that existed beneath words. They did not speak much that night. Instead, they simply sat together in the darkness, and Samuel told her more about his life, about the work in the fields, about the casual cruelties that were so normalized that no one even seemed to notice them anymore, about the way time moved differently for an enslaved person, how a day could feel like a year, how a year could feel like a lifetime, how the future was always uncertain, always subject to the whim of the man who owned you. "I could be sold tomorrow," he said quietly. "Your husband could decide that I'm not profitable enough, or that he wants to punish me for some real or imagined transgression, and I could be taken away. Put on a wagon, sold to another plantation, perhaps somewhere even worse than here. I could be separated from everyone I know. Everything could change in an instant. That won't happen, Margaret said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. It could happen. It could happen at any moment. The world offered no guarantees to people like Samuel. No security, no permanence, no promise that tomorrow would be like today. You can't promise that, Samuel said gently, and I don't want you to try. I don't want false comfort. I want truth, and the truth is that my life is not my own. The truth is that I exist at the sufferance of a man who could destroy me on a whim. The truth is that anything good that happens to me is temporary. It's borrowed time. Then we'll make the most of the time we have, Margaret said, and she reached for his hand again. This became their pattern. Night after night, Margaret would slip out of the house and make her way to Samuel's cabin. They would talk. They would sit in the darkness and share pieces of themselves. They would create a world that existed only in those stolen hours, a world where the rules that governed the outside world did not apply. But the world has a way of intruding on such private sanctuaries. The world has a way of destroying the fragile spaces that people create when they dare to transgress against its laws. It was on the seventh night that everything changed. Margaret was returning to the house, moving through the pre-dawn darkness as she always did, when she heard a voice call out to her. A man's voice, cold, authoritative, a voice that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Mrs. Ashford. She turned to see her husband's overseer, a man named Garrett, standing perhaps 20 yards away. He was a large man with a cruel face, the kind of face that seemed to have been shaped by years of inflicting pain on others. He was holding a lantern, and in its light she could see the expression on his face. It was a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked like satisfaction. "Mr. Garrett," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What are you doing out at this hour?" "I might ask you the same question, ma'am," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. "I was checking on the livestock when I saw you coming from the direction of the slave quarters, alone, in the darkness, at an hour when no respectable woman should be abroad." Margaret's mind raced. She needed to construct a lie, something plausible, something that would explain her presence without revealing the truth. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I took a walk to clear my head. I must have wandered farther than I intended." "Indeed," Garrett said, and he moved closer to her. In the light of his lantern she could see his eyes, and what she saw there terrified her. "It's curious, ma'am, because I've seen you making this same walk every night for the past week. Every night at approximately the same time, always heading in the direction of the slave quarters, and always returning alone in the pre-dawn darkness." Margaret felt her heart begin to race even faster. She had been so careful. She had thought she was being so careful. But apparently she had been observed, watched. Her transgression had been noted. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Garrett," Margaret said, and she tried to put steel into her voice, tried to use her position as the mistress of the plantation to intimidate him. "But I can assure you that my evening walks are entirely innocent." "Of course, ma'am," Garrett said, and there was mockery in his voice now. "I'm sure they are. Although I must say it would be a terrible shame if your husband were to hear about these walks. I'm sure he would have questions. I'm sure he would want to know exactly where you were going and what you were doing. I'm sure he would want to investigate thoroughly." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Garrett was offering her a choice. She could acknowledge what he suspected, or she could allow him to report his observations to Thomas. Either way, the outcome would be catastrophic. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, quietly. "Want?" Garrett smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had cornered its prey. "I want what any man wants, ma'am. I want to understand the situation. I want to know what a respectable white woman is doing sneaking out of her husband's house in the middle of the night to visit a slave cabin. I want to know what kind of relationship exists between you and that boy. and I want to be compensated for my discretion." Compensated? Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She understood now what he was asking. He was asking for money, for silence, for his complicity in her transgression. "A sum of money," Garrett said. "Say, $500? That's a reasonable price for a man's silence, don't you think? Especially when what he has observed could destroy a marriage and ruin a woman's reputation?" Margaret's mind was spinning. $500 was a fortune. It was more money than she had access to. Thomas controlled all of her finances. She could not simply withdraw such a sum without his knowledge and approval. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. "Then I suggest you find a way to get it," Garrett said, "because if you don't, I'll have no choice but to inform your husband of what I've observed, and I'm sure that will lead to a very thorough investigation, an investigation that will undoubtedly reveal the nature of your relationship with that slave, an investigation that will likely result in his punishment, a severe punishment, perhaps even his sale to another plantation, or worse." The threat hung in the air between them. Garrett was offering her a choice, but it was no choice at all. Either she paid him money she didn't have, or she allowed Samuel to be destroyed. "I need time," Margaret said. "You have 3 days," Garrett said. "After that, I'll assume you've chosen to let me inform your husband, and we both know how that will end." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Margaret standing alone with the lantern light fading into the distance. She made her way back to the house in a daze. Her mind was not functioning properly. She felt as though she was moving through a nightmare, as though none of this was real. But it was real. Garrett had seen her. Garrett knew. And now she had 3 days to figure out how to save Samuel from the consequences of her transgression. She spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled panic. She moved through her duties mechanically. She smiled when appropriate. She said the right things. But inside, her mind was working frantically, trying to find a solution to an impossible problem. That night, she did not go to Samuel's cabin. She could not. She was too afraid that Garrett might be watching. Too afraid that any further contact between them would only make things worse. But the next morning, she found a way to get a message to him. She left a note hidden beneath a stone near the garden where he worked. A simple message. "Do not come to the cabin. We have been discovered. I am working on a solution. Trust me." She watched from a distance as he found the note, watched as he read it, his face remaining perfectly blank even as she could see the shock and fear in his eyes. Watched as he destroyed the note, crumpling it and scattering it to the wind. That night, she lay in her bed and tried to think. She needed money. $500. It was an impossible sum. Unless she could convince Thomas to give it to her. But how? What excuse could she possibly offer? What reason could she give for needing such a large sum of money? And even if she managed to get the money, even if she paid Garrett off, what then? The threat would always exist. He would always know. He could always come back and demand more. This was not a solution. This was merely a postponement of the inevitable. She was trapped. They were both trapped, and she had no idea how to escape. But what Margaret didn't know was that Garrett's discovery was only the beginning, that there were other eyes watching, other people who had noticed the strange pattern of her movements, other people who had their own reasons for wanting to see her destroyed, that the machinery of their world, once set in motion, could not be stopped, that everything was about to fall apart in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Margaret spent the next day in barely controlled desperation. Her mind was consumed with the problem of Garrett's blackmail and the terrible knowledge that no amount of money could truly solve what had been set in motion. That afternoon, Thomas appeared in the library doorway. "Margaret," he said, "we need to talk." Her heart seized in her chest. He knew. "Garrett has informed me that you've been taking unusual evening walks," Thomas said, settling into a chair across from her. "Walks that take you toward the slave quarters, specifically toward the cabin of a man named Samuel." Margaret's mouth went dry. Garrett had already reported to Thomas. The blackmail had been a test. "I've been having trouble sleeping," she said carefully. "The evening air helps clear my mind." "Is that so?" Thomas leaned back, studying her face. "Because Garrett seems to believe your walks have been quite deliberate, quite regular, quite specific in their destination." The name hung in the air like an accusation. "That's absurd," Margaret said, but her voice betrayed her. Thomas stood and began to pace. "A white woman fraternizing with a slave, creating an intimacy that violates every law of our society. Do you understand what that means, Margaret?" He grabbed her chin and forced her to look at him. "Have you been meeting with Samuel?" Margaret saw the abyss behind his eyes. She understood she was facing a choice that would determine everything. "Yes," she said quietly. "We have talked. We have shared ideas. But nothing improper." Thomas's hand struck her face with brutal force. She tasted blood. "You have disgraced me," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Every man on this plantation will know my wife has been consorting with a slave." He moved toward the door and called out. Garrett appeared with 2 other men. "Take the slave, Samuel," Thomas commanded. "Put him in the stocks. 50 lashes at sunrise. Let everyone watch." "No," Margaret cried, reaching for Thomas. "Please, you can't do this." "I can do whatever I wish," he said coldly. "He is my property. You are my property." The men held her as Garrett and the others left. She heard the commotion outside as they searched for Samuel. She watched from her window as they brought him to the stocks in the center of the plantation. She did not sleep that night. She watched as the sun rose. She watched as people gathered. She watched as Thomas appeared with a whip. The first crack of the whip against flesh sounded like thunder. Samuel cried out, trying to suppress the sound. The whip fell again and again. Margaret counted the lashes, and with each one, something inside her died. By the 50th lash, Samuel hung unconscious in the stocks, his back a mass of bleeding welts. That evening, Thomas came to her room. "I hope you've learned your lesson," he said. "I hope you understand the consequences of your actions." "Where is he?" Margaret whispered. "Is he alive?" "That is not your concern," Thomas said. "As for you, you will remain confined to this house. You will have no contact with anyone outside these walls. You will live in this room and contemplate what you have done." "How long?" Margaret asked. "For as long as I decide," Thomas said. "Perhaps forever." He paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing. Samuel has been sold. He leaves for Mississippi tomorrow. You will never see him again. You will never know what became of him." He left, locking the door behind him. Margaret moved to the window and looked out at the plantation, at the slaves working in the fields, at the overseer's men on horseback, at the world that continued on, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to anything except the maintenance of the system that kept it all in place. She understood now the true nature of her imprisonment. It was not simply the lock on her door. It was the entire structure of society. It was the power that men like Thomas wielded. She had been naive. She had thought that recognition of Samuel's humanity would be enough. She had thought that love would transcend the brutal reality of their world. But it wasn't. Love was nothing in the face of power. But Margaret's imprisonment was only the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, she would discover that the consequences of her actions extended far beyond what she had imagined. That Thomas had plans for her that went far deeper than simple confinement. That there were secrets hidden in the darkness of Thornfield that would make her wish for the simplicity of her current captivity. 3 months passed. Margaret lost track of time in her locked room. Days blurred, together into endless monotony. 4 walls, a bed, a chair, a window that looked out over the plantation but offered no escape. The servants who brought her food would not speak to her. Thomas had forbidden it. She was to be isolated completely. She tried to read the religious texts Thomas had left, but they only reinforced her submission. At night, she stood at her window searching the darkness for Samuel, though she knew he was gone. One evening, Thomas visited. "I have decided you will remain confined indefinitely," he said coldly. "But there is one more thing. A physician will visit tomorrow to perform a procedure, one designed to ensure you will never bear children. This is both punishment and precaution." Margaret felt something break inside her. "Thomas, please." "There is nothing more to discuss," he said, and left. The next day, the physician arrived. He examined her with clinical detachment, then performed a brutal procedure while she was strapped to the bed. She screamed, but no one came. When it was over, she lay bleeding, violated and powerless. The pain faded, but something deeper remained broken. Years passed. Margaret lost count of how long she had been confined. The world outside continued. Seasons changed, new faces appeared and disappeared on the plantation. But Margaret remained locked in her room, watching from behind glass. She began talking to herself, creating conversations with people no longer there. She imagined discussions with Samuel, wondering if he had survived, if he ever thought of her. One day, she noticed the servants looking at her differently, pity mixed with fear. She asked Ruth, a young servant bringing her meal, "How long have I been here?" Ruth glanced nervously toward the door. "Years, ma'am," she whispered. "A long time. The other servants say you've been here since before I was born." "What year is it?" Margaret asked desperately. "It's 1857, ma'am," Ruth said. Margaret sat heavily. 1857. So many years of isolation. "Do you know what happened to Samuel?" Margaret asked. "The slave sold to Mississippi?" Ruth's face went pale. She spoke quickly. "He's dead, ma'am. He died about 5 years after he was sold. He was worked to death, never recovered from the whipping. They say he just gave up." Ruth left before Margaret could respond. Margaret sat on her bed as something inside her died completely. Samuel was dead. He had suffered and died in Mississippi while she was locked in this room, imagining conversations with a ghost. She had killed him. Her transgression had led to his punishment, his sale, his death. She had blood on her hands. But the revelation of Samuel's death was only the beginning of Margaret's descent into madness. In the darkness of her room, she would begin to see things that weren't there, to hear voices with no source, to lose the ability to distinguish between reality and the elaborate fantasies her broken mind had constructed.